Her mother gave the rose another name. 18 years later, it bloomed for the woman she had cast out. The first thing Margaret Cross saw upon returning to Rochester was her own rose wearing her brother's name. It stood beneath the glass roof of Horticultural Hall, lifted above the other exhibits on a white pedestal. The outer petals were the color of cream warmed beside a fire. Toward the center, they deepened to copper, as if the flower had kept one last coal alive inside itself. A blue ribbon hung from the vase. Beside it, a printed card announced that Thomas Sayer had created the celebrated Sayer's Devotion in the spring of 1889. Margaret had made that rose with her own hands when Thomas was 12 years old. She had chosen the seed parent, carried pollen between the glasshouses with a camel hair brush, guarded the hips from mice, and waited through 2 winters for the first bloom. She had been 19 then, impatient and sun-browned, with soil in the cracks of her fingers and no understanding of how easily a woman's work could be separated from her name. Now, at 38, she stood before the flower with one small valise, $11 sewn into the hem of her skirt, and the knowledge that her husband had been living with another woman for nearly a year. A young attendant mistook her silence for admiration. He told her Sayer's Devotion had saved the family nursery after the hard winter of 1890. Every bride in Western New York wanted it in her bouquet. Every respectable garden wanted it by the front gate. Margaret looked at the copper heart of the rose and asked who had told him Thomas created it. The attendant smiled. Everyone knew that, he said. Mrs. Edith Sayer herself had presented the rose to the society. At the sound of her mother's name, Margaret felt the journey settle into her bones. She had spent the night upright in a train carriage, unable to sleep, imagining many forms of welcome. None of them had included this. Across the hall, a glass pitcher slipped from someone's hand and struck the floor. Thomas Sayer stood among a group of buyers, staring at his sister over the broken glass. He had grown broad through the waist and thin at the temples. His beard was trimmed in the style of a man who wanted to be taken for someone more decisive than he was. For one naked instant, his face held the frightened expression of the boy who used to hide behind Margaret whenever their father raised his voice. Then Edith Sayer turned. Margaret's mother was 64 and dressed in deep violet, the color she had chosen when she decided that 12 years of widow's black were enough. Her back remained perfectly straight. A spray of orchids was pinned beneath her high collar. Age had thinned her face, but not softened it. She crossed the hall without haste. She did not embrace Margaret. She did not touch her valise. Her eyes moved once over the worn cuffs, the travel dust, and the place on Margaret's glove where a wedding band should have pressed against the leather. Then she told the attendant that Mrs. Cross was an old member of the family who had arrived unexpectedly and needed a quiet room. An old member of the family. Not her daughter. Not the woman who had bred the rose between them. Margaret understood the warning. Rochester's nursery owners, churchwomen, and catalog buyers filled the hall. A deserted wife was a subject for lowered voices. A daughter, returning after 18 years, was a story. Edith Sayer had never permitted a story she could not control. Margaret said she would wait outside. Her mother answered that Sayers did not make scenes in public. Margaret glanced at the false name beside the flower. Then she looked back at Edith and said very quietly, "It appears they do." It was the only direct challenge she managed that day. By the time Thomas's carriage reached the family nursery on Mount Hope Avenue, rain had begun to darken the road. Rochester spread around them in damp brick, budding trees, and the tall chimneys of a city that had grown larger without asking Margaret's permission. Electric street lamps had appeared along roads she remembered by gaslight. The Genesee still moved north, brown and strong, but nearly everything beside it had changed. The Sayer house had not. It stood behind the sales yard, square and grey, with white pillars and dark shutters. Beyond it, glass houses shone through the rain. Some were new, long and low,
heated by iron pipes that ran from the boiler house. Others leaned under patched panes and old timber. Margaret knew each roofline. She could still have crossed the property at midnight without losing her way. No one used the front steps.
Edith led her around the side, past the potting shed, and through the door by the scullery. The choice was deliberate. Delivery boys, kitchen girls, and laborers used that door. Daughters who had married with their mother's blessing entered beneath the white pillars. Margaret followed because rain had soaked the shoulders of her coat and because she had nowhere else to go. At supper, she met the family that had continued in her absence. Thomas's wife, Frances, wore 3 strands of jet beads and the cautious expression of a woman afraid disgrace might be catching. Their daughter, Celia, was 19. She had Margaret's old habit of tucking one thumb inside her fist when anxious, though no one remarked upon it. She had a long, intelligent face and a faint green stain beneath one fingernail. That stain told Margaret more than the girl's formal greeting. Celia had been handling tomato vines or pinching side buds from young chrysanthemums. Frances would never have allowed it before supper. The girl had done it secretly. Edith remained standing at the head of the table. She announced the terms under which Margaret might stay. The smallest room on the 3rd floor would be available until other arrangements could be made. Margaret would help in the older glasshouses, where customers seldom went. She would not serve in the shop or attend society functions. In town, she would be addressed as Mrs. Cross, because whatever Julian had done, the law still considered him her husband. She would not discuss her marriage with Celia, the servants, the nursery hands, or anyone connected to the Sayer name. Frances added that Celia's prospects must be considered. The girl's face colored. Margaret asked what prospects required such careful protection. Edith said the Beckett family would visit in June. Their eldest son, Harold, had recently joined his father's chain of dry goods stores.
A connection between the families would give the Sayer Nursery access to customers from Buffalo to Albany. Celia lowered her eyes to her plate. It was not an engagement, Frances said quickly. It was only an understanding between suitable people. Margaret had once heard that same phrase used about her. At 19, before Julian Cross came to sketch peonies for the spring catalogue, Edith had cultivated an understanding between Margaret and the son of a seed merchant. No one had asked whether affection might grow in such soil. Respectability was considered nourishment enough. Margaret looked at Celia and saw the old table, the old fear, and a young woman being discussed as if she were a favorable strip of land. Edith ended the subject by turning to Margaret. She said one thing more. Sayer's devotion was not to be mentioned. Thomas studied the white cloth. Frances lifted her water glass. Celia's hidden thumb pressed deeper into her palm.
Margaret asked whether the rose had learned not to recognize her. Her mother's mouth tightened. The rose belonged to the nursery, she said. Margaret had left the nursery. She had chosen a husband over her family and carried the consequences of that choice home with her. No one would be permitted to reopen a wound merely because she had finally discovered that the world could be unkind. The cruelty was clean and practiced. Edith did not raise her voice. She never needed to. Margaret pushed back her chair. She was tired enough to shake, but she would not let them watch her plead. She carried her valise upstairs and found the narrow room beneath the eaves prepared with a washstand, an iron bed, and a view of the boiler chimney. On the pillow lay a folded gray dress that had belonged to a dead aunt. It was the sort of dress a woman wore when she wished to be overlooked. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed until the rain stopped. Below her, doors opened and closed. The boiler gave a low metallic groan. Somewhere in the dark, a worker crossed the yard with a lantern, and the long roofs of the glasshouses caught its light, one pane at a time. She had spent 18 years telling herself she would never return. During the first year of marriage, that promise had felt like loyalty. During the 5th, it had become pride. By the 10th, it was shame. In the final months, after she learned about Julian's other household, It had been the last wall still standing around her. Now the wall was gone. She took off her wet coat, opened the valise, and removed the only thing she had carried from Julian's house that did not belong to her by law or memory. It was a pair of pruning shears, darkened with age, their handles wrapped in smooth black leather. Her father had given them to her when she was 16. Julian had used them to cut picture wire. Margaret laid the shears on the washstand. For a long while she listened to the wind moving over acres of glass. Then, from somewhere behind the oldest houses came a sound she remembered from childhood. One loose pane tapping softly in its frame. 3 taps. A pause. 3 taps again. The East Glasshouse had made that sound whenever the wind turned north. Margaret rose and went to the window. The East House had been closed before her wedding. Its furnace consumed too much coal, and its glass was clouded with mineral stain. Yet beyond the newer roofs, she saw a faint amber square where no light should have been. Someone was keeping the abandoned house warm. The next morning, Edith sent Margaret to work before breakfast. Amos Bell waited in the potting shed. He had been head propagator when Margaret was a girl and seemed, at first glance, to have become part of the building. His back had bent, his white mustache drooped over his mouth. Soil had settled so deeply into the lines of his hands that no soap could have removed it. He took off his cap when he saw her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Amos said she had her father's shears. Margaret looked down. She had slipped them into her apron without thinking. She asked whether he had known she was coming. He answered that Mrs. Sayer had ordered a fire lit in the third-floor room 2 days earlier, but no one had dared ask why. Edith preferred obedience to curiosity. He showed Margaret her work. Hundreds of young rose plants stood in clay pots along cold frames, many blackened by a failure in the heating pipes. A late frost had entered during the night. The nursery's best workers had been moved to prepare orders, so the damaged stock had been left for culling. Margaret understood. Her mother had given her the plants considered least worth saving. She moved slowly between the benches. Some canes were dead to the graft, others held green beneath their bark. She scraped each stem lightly with a thumbnail, sorted the living from the lost, and sharpened her shears. Amos watched her make the first cut. He said no more about her return. There was mercy in that. By noon, she had rescued 43 plants everyone else had marked for burning. Celia appeared at the door carrying a basket of bread and cheese. She claimed the kitchen maid had sent it, but the napkin was folded too carefully, and a small jar of quince preserve had been tucked beneath the bread. Margaret guessed the girl had packed it herself. Celia lingered while Amos went to the boiler house. She looked at the pruned roses and asked how Margaret knew where life ended. Margaret showed her the pale green crescent beneath the bark. Dead wood, she explained, broke without resistance. Living wood bent first. The trick was not to mistake damage for death. The girl repeated the words as if committing them to memory. Before she could ask another question, Frances called from the yard. Celia left quickly, but not before Margaret saw the hunger in her face. It was not hunger for gossip about a disgraced aunt. It was the hunger of a young woman who wanted to be taught something real. For the next week, Margaret worked among the frost-struck roses. Her hands remembered before the rest of her did. They remembered the angle of a clean cut, the pressure needed to firm soil around a weak root, the nearly invisible webbing that meant red spider. She returned to the glasshouse after supper, when no one had ordered her to, and adjusted vents by moonlight. She slept badly, but woke before the boiler whistle, already thinking of the plants. The work did not make her happy. Happiness was too bright a word for what she felt. It made her present. In Julian's house, the days had gradually lost their edges. He traveled to draw advertisements, returned with other people's perfume on his cuffs, and told Margaret she imagined what she could plainly see. He had sold her botanical illustrations under his signature and laughed when she protested.
Publishers contracted with men, he explained.
Wives helped their husbands. The world had rules, and only foolish women bruised themselves against them. By the end, she had stopped drawing, stopped planting boxes on the sill, stopped asking when he would come home. Now, a blind bud on a damaged cane could hold her attention for 10 full minutes. On the 9th evening, she saw the light again in the east glasshouse. Amos had gone. The yard lay blue with dusk. Margaret crossed behind the boiler house and found the narrow path choked with dock leaves. The east house stood apart from the others, its roof patched with tin in 2 places. The chain circled the door handles, but the padlock hung open. Inside, the air smelled of damp brick, old roses, and the faint sulfur of the furnace. Only 1 lamp burned. Most benches were empty. At the far end stood a single clay tub. The plant inside it looked ancient. 1 twisted cane rose from a trunk thick as Margaret's wrist. Fresh shoots had been tied to wires along the wall and around the base. Someone had banked clean moss with the care usually given to valuable stock. No bloom showed. No proper label hung from the tub, but a strip of blackened brass had been wired to the old trunk. 2 letters were stamped into it by hand. M.S. Margaret knew the uneven strike of the second letter. At 19, she had held the stamp crooked and hit it twice. This was the original root of Sayer's devotion. The plant Edith claimed belonged to the nursery had been hidden in a locked glasshouse, heated through 18 winters, and marked with Margaret's name. Behind her, the chain moved against the door. Edith stood on the threshold with the open padlock in her hand. Her face had gone pale, but her voice remained controlled. She told Margaret to leave the plant alone. Margaret touched the brass strip. She asked why it was still there. Edith said old roots sometimes provided useful stock. There were 100 better root stocks in the new houses. They both knew it. Margaret asked why the lamp was lit, why the moss was fresh, and why a dying plant had been given coal when Edith once refused to heat the room where her own daughter slept. The last words escaped before Margaret could call them back. For the first time, pain moved openly across Edith's face. Then the old discipline returned. She said the past would not be tried in a glasshouse like a criminal before a court. The plant was to be cut down after the spring exhibition. Until then, Margaret would not enter again. She closed the padlock and took the key. Margaret stood outside as the lamp burned behind clouded panes. She should have felt only anger. Instead, an unfamiliar question had entered the room with her mother. Edith Sayer discarded what threatened the family name. She had discarded Margaret with ruthless efficiency. So why had she kept the rose alive? Amos refused to answer. Margaret asked him the next morning while they packed damp sphagnum around bare roots. He kept his eyes on the work and said the East House was Mrs. Sayer's concern. When Margaret reminded him that the brass tag carried her initials, he tied a length of twine so tightly that it snapped. Some loyalties, he said, were older than explanations. That answer angered her more than silence. It suggested everyone had been guarding a history in which she alone was not permitted to participate. She spent the afternoon cutting rot from young plants. Each dark section reminded her of something removed from the family story: her work, her place at the table, her daughter's brief life, even the sound of her own first name spoken without judgment. Julian had first spoken it beautifully. He arrived at the Sayer Nursery in the summer of 1888, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing a straw hat too fine for fieldwork. He was 27, 8 years older than Margaret, and had been hired to paint color plates for the spring catalogue. At that time, most printed flower pictures were clumsy things, brighter than nature and twice as stiff. Julian's were different. His roses seemed heavy with dew, his lilies bent as though a breeze had just passed over the page. He watched Margaret work in the breeding house,
and told her that she had a scientist's patience and an artist's eye. No man had ever praised both at once. Her father valued patience, but thought art a decoration. Edith valued beauty, but believed a daughter's intelligence should be displayed cautiously, like expensive china. Julian made Margaret feel that nothing in her needed to be hidden. She showed him the first bud of the new seedling before she showed anyone else. It opened during a thunderstorm. Rain struck the roof so hard they had to stand close to hear each other. The flower was not the pale yellow Margaret expected.
Its outer petals held the subdued color of candle wax, while the folded center burned copper red. Julian said it looked like devotion after disappointment, gentler on the outside, but not extinguished. Margaret laughed and called that a painter's answer. In her private breeding book, which had later vanished during one of their moves, she named the seedling After Rain. Edith did not approve of Julian. He had charm but no property. He moved too often, owed money to printers in 2 cities, and treated every boundary as evidence of another person's small mind. Edith saw all this within a week. What she did not see was how desperately her daughter wanted one choice that belonged only to her. By winter, Edith had renewed discussions with the seed merchant's son. Margaret refused him. The refusal became an argument, then a struggle over the shape of her entire life. Her father tried to soften both women and pleased neither. Thomas, still a boy, listened from the stairs.
In March of 1889, Margaret married Julian before a justice in Syracuse. She left before dawn with 1 trunk, her father's pruning shears, and 2 small plants of after rain wrapped in burlap. She believed courage and love were the same thing because both made her heart beat hard. Edith did not attend the wedding. Her father died of pneumonia the following January. Margaret learned of it after the burial. Julian said a newspaper announcement had reached them late. She wrote home and received no answer. That spring, a color plate of Sayer's devotion appeared in the nursery catalogue beneath Thomas's name. Margaret saw the illustration in the window of a Boston florist. The flower was hers, down to a small notch in 1 guard petal, but the painting was not Julian's. She stood on the pavement until a clerk asked whether she was ill. When she confronted her husband, he said she had abandoned the plant and could not expect her mother to discard a profitable introduction out of sentiment. He also said no horticultural society would take a 19-year-old runaway wife seriously. The humiliation was so complete that Margaret tried to turn it into contempt. She told herself the renamed rose no longer mattered. It mattered every spring. The 2 plants she carried from Rochester died during the hard winter after her father's death. One froze when Julian forgot to close a cellar window. The other survived until he knocked its pot from a sill during an argument. Margaret had knelt among the shards, gathering soil with bare hands, while he accused her of caring more for a thorn bush than for her marriage. 3 years later, their daughter was born too soon. Laura lived 8 days. Margaret remembered almost nothing about those days in order. There had been a rented room in South Boston, hot despite the February cold, a doctor with tobacco on his breath, the tiny pull of Laura's mouth against a spoon,
Julian's footsteps going down the stairs because he could not bear the crying. Then silence, and a nurse drawing a sheet over a basket beside the bed. Margaret asked Julian to contact her mother. He told her he already had. Edith's answer, he said, was that Margaret had chosen her life and must not bring its sorrows home. He said the Sayers would not permit the child in their family plot. Laura was buried while Margaret still had fever, in a place Julian described only as ground maintained by the city. For months, she dreamed of an unmarked patch of frozen earth. That was the year something inside her began to close. She remained with Julian because leaving him would not restore the baby, because a wife without money had few doors, and because returning to Rochester after her mother's supposed refusal felt more impossible than enduring the rooms she already occupied. She became useful to her husband instead. She prepared drawings, mixed washes, corrected the shape of leaves he did not understand. He signed the work. She kept the house. They moved whenever debts or opportunities required it. There were good weeks, even good months. That truth embarrassed her most. Julian could be generous when admired and tender when he feared losing comfort. After each betrayal, he returned with a gift, a plan, or a story in which he had been misunderstood. Margaret wanted those stories to be true. Wanting became a habit long after belief had gone. In 1906, she discovered he had rented a house in Cambridge for a singer named Lillian Price and introduced Lillian as his widowed sister. A neighbor assumed Margaret knew. Julian did not deny it. He asked what she expected him to do with a wife who had spent years behaving like a room no one entered. Margaret left the next morning. She did not leave because she had become brave in a single night.
She left because the sentence revealed the shape of her disappearance. Julian had benefited from her silence, and then blamed her for becoming silent. If she stayed, she knew she would soon accept even that. For 5 months, she worked in a laundry and rented a narrow room from a widow in Worcester. She saved $11. Then a coughing illness cost her the work. Pride lasted 3 hungry days after that. She sent one telegram to Rochester. Edith Sayer, may I come home? Margaret. The answer contained 4 words. You may come alone. Margaret had read mercy into them on the journey west. At the family table, she learned they had been terms of surrender. On Sunday, Frances insisted Margaret attend church. Absence would provoke questions, she said, and questions were more dangerous than sight. She lent Margaret a black hat with a veil that cast a netted shadow over her face. The Sayer family occupied the 3rd pew on the right, where they had sat since Caleb Sayer donated palms for the chancel at no charge. Edith entered first. Thomas and Frances followed. Celia walked behind them. Margaret was directed to the end, nearest the aisle, with enough distance between herself and the others to make her look less like kin than a dependent companion. The separation did not prevent recognition. During the hymn, heads turned. At the end of the service, Mrs. Eleanor Vining, president of the Rochester Horticultural Society, approached Edith beneath the stone arch. She was a handsome widow with silver hair and the soft voice of a woman who enjoyed cruelty only when manners concealed it. She welcomed Mrs. Cross back to her mother's roof and said the Christian home had always been a refuge for women afflicted by unfortunate judgment. Margaret felt Celia stiffen beside her. Edith thanked Mrs. Vining for her concern. Mrs. Vining then asked whether Margaret had seen Thomas's blue ribbon. She said it must be comforting to know that the little rose Margaret had played with as a girl had been developed into something important by steadier hands. There, beneath a carved angel, and in full hearing of 6 women pretending to adjust their gloves, Margaret endured the first public erasure of her return. She could have corrected Mrs. Vining. She imagined saying the dates, the cross, the location of the first seedling bench. But Thomas's face had gone damp with fear. Frances looked ready to faint. Edith's gaze rested on Margaret with the pressure of a hand over the mouth. Margaret said only that roses often survived the people who named them. Mrs. Vining did not understand the answer, but she disliked it. Outside, Celia caught up with Margaret near the carriage. She whispered that everyone in the nursery knew Thomas could barely tell a promising hip from a diseased one. Old workers still called Sayer's devotion Miss Margaret when the family was not near. It was the first kindness anyone had offered without disguising it as duty. Margaret asked how Celia knew. The girl admitted she spent time in the propagation houses. Her grandmother considered that useful until marriage, provided no one mistook interest for ambition. Edith believed customers liked a young woman carrying flowers. She did not believe they would trust one making decisions about them. Margaret looked at the green stain that had returned beneath Celia's thumbnail. She told the girl to meet her in the frost house at 6 the next morning. Their lessons began in secret. At first, Margaret taught only practical things: how to see scale on the underside of a leaf, how to cut above an outward-facing bud, how to judge whether a root had been packed too wet. Celia learned quickly. She did not pretend knowledge she lacked, which Margaret valued more than confidence. Soon the questions deepened. Why did one seedling inherit vigor while another inherited scent? Why did some promising first blooms become ordinary in the second year? Could a rose be selected for strength without losing delicacy? Margaret felt an old part of herself unfold in answer. They worked before breakfast and again after the last customer left. Amos discovered them on the third day. He grunted, placed a jar of clean grafting wax on the bench, and began leaving useful tools where Celia could find them. No one spoke of secrecy. They simply practiced it. One morning, Celia brought news that a buyer named Silas Beckett would visit with his son. Beckett's stores had begun selling packaged bulbs and rose plants by mail. He wanted exclusive use of the Sayer name for a national spring promotion. Edith believed the agreement could make the nursery secure for another generation. Harold Beckett was part of the agreement without being written into it.
He had danced twice with Celia at a winter assembly, sent her a box of candied violets, and spoken to Thomas about the advantages of connecting business families. He was 31 and had once corrected Celia's pronunciation of a French rose she had grown herself. Celia said everyone called him kind because he never shouted. Margaret asked whether Celia wanted him. The girl's hands stopped over a pot. No one had asked her that before. She answered that wanting appeared to be the least relevant part. Margaret heard her own younger voice. She also heard Edith's warning that the world was unkind, and Julian's insistence that the world had rules. Both had used reality as if it were a locked gate for which only they possessed a key. She told Celia that refusing one future did not guarantee a better one. It guaranteed only that the refusal would belong to her. Sometimes that was enough to begin. The girl looked frightened, but she did not look away. The visit from the Becketts took place beneath striped awnings in the sales yard. Edith ordered every path swept and had benches arranged with azaleas in full color. Frances wore dove gray. Celia wore pale blue and carried a basket she had not chosen. Margaret was sent to the east end of the property to clean empty pots. From behind the packing shed, she saw Silas Beckett walking with Edith. He was a heavy man with a polished cane and the restless eyes of someone pricing everything he passed. Harold stayed close to Celia. Whenever she tried to speak about a plant, he turned the conversation toward parties, houses, and the number of servants his mother employed. Thomas led them to a display of Sayer's devotion. Beckett wanted 50,000 plants over 3 years. He wanted the rose described as a symbol of the American home, pure in its outer petals, faithful in its enduring center. He also wanted a new introduction for the following spring, something no rival nursery could sell. Edith promised him one. Thomas's head turned sharply. Frances's smile froze. The Sayers had no new rose ready for introduction. Margaret knew, because she had inspected the young stock. There were healthy seedlings and pretty accidents, but nothing stable enough to bear the family name across thousands of gardens. Edith continued, as though certainty could produce a flower. She said her granddaughter had inherited the Sayer gift and would present the new rose at the Midsummer Exhibition in July. Celia's basket tilted. Harold steadied it and smiled as if already performing a husband's kindness. Later, in the frost house, Celia was nearly sick with panic. Edith expected her to select a rose in 7 weeks, though the work required years. Thomas had suggested choosing an existing seedling and improving the description. Frances said customers bought a story as much as a plant. Margaret thought of the card beside Sayer's devotion. She told Celia a lie could sell one season and poison every season after it. Together they examined the nursery's seedlings. One plant drew Margaret back. It had been dismissed because its first flower opened unevenly and its stems bent beneath the bloom. But the petals held an unusual smoky pink at the edges, and the leaves resisted mildew in a damp corner where neighboring plants had spotted black. Strength was present. Form was not. Margaret explained that it could not become a finished introduction by July. No honest breeder could promise that. But it could become the beginning of Celia's work, if the girl was willing to wait. Celia touched the imperfect flower with one finger. She said the family did not appear to understand waiting unless it could be sold. That evening, Margaret returned to the East House. She did not have the key. Amos did. He stood beside the locked door, turning his cap in his hands. Without meeting her eyes, he opened the padlock and said the old plant needed pruning. Mrs. Sayer had forbidden Margaret to enter, but she had not forbidden Amos from choosing help. Inside, the first bud had appeared on the ancient cane. It was no larger than a pea wrapped in green sepals, but Margaret recognized the slight bronze tint beneath them. Her breath caught. 18 winters had narrowed the trunk, killed branches, and scarred the graft. Still, the plant had gathered enough life to make one flower. She asked Amos again why Edith had saved it. This time the old man said Margaret was asking the smaller question. He told her to bring a coat the following morning. They were going to Mount Hope Cemetery. The cemetery rose over the city in green slopes, old trees and stone. Rain had washed the air clean. Amos drove a small nursery wagon and said little as the horse climbed between monuments belonging to merchants, mayors, infants, and families whose names still opened doors downtown. The Sayer plot lay beneath a copper beech. Margaret saw her father's stone first. Caleb Sayer, husband and father. The dates cut into the granite ended the winter after her marriage. Beside him was an empty place intended for Edith. Farther down the slope stood a marker Margaret did not recognize. It was small, no taller than her knee. Moss had gathered in the carved letters, but someone had cleaned the face recently. Laura Margaret Cross, beloved child, February 1892. At the base grew a low, thorny rose not yet in bloom. Margaret did not feel herself kneel. One moment she was standing, and the next, damp earth had soaked through her skirt. For 15 years she had imagined her daughter beneath unnamed ground in Boston. She had pictured city grass, strangers' feet, winter mud. She had carried the shame of not knowing where to take flowers. Laura had been here. Laura had carried both her mother's names. Amos remained several paces away. Margaret pressed her fingers against the cold, carved letters. She asked who had done this. Amos said Edith had. 3 days after the baby died, a man from Boston brought the small coffin to Rochester. Edith received it in the sales yard after dark. She chose the name for the stone, arranged the burial, and stood alone with Amos while frozen soil struck the lid. Margaret's grief turned so sharply that she could hardly breathe. If Edith had known, then Julian had lied. If Edith had cared enough to bring Laura home, why had she left Margaret there? Amos said Mrs. Sayer went to Boston in person before the burial. She was gone 2 days. When she returned, her gloves were torn, and there was blood on one palm. She would not say what had happened. She ordered the east glasshouse furnace lit, and never again permitted it to go entirely cold. Margaret looked at the rose beneath the marker. It was Sayer's devotion. Amos said Edith planted it the following spring. She came to the grave every week in growing weather. Sometimes she brought shears. Sometimes she only stood. Margaret wanted this knowledge to comfort her. Instead, it broke the past open. Her mother had not been indifferent. Indifference would have been simpler. Edith had loved in secret and punished in public. She had named the child and erased the mother. She had preserved a rose while leaving her daughter inside a marriage that was slowly destroying her. Margaret sat beside Laura's grave until the sun moved behind the beach. When she finally rose, she did not thank Amos. Gratitude was not yet possible. But she took one dead twig from the little rose and cut it cleanly back to living wood. The stem bent before it yielded. Edith was waiting in the parlor when Margaret returned. Late sunlight lay across the carpet. On the table between them stood a silver bowl filled with Sayer's devotion, each bloom cut at the same stage and turned outward for perfect effect. Margaret wondered whether her mother had placed them there deliberately, or whether the whole house had become an accusation. Edith asked what Amos had told her. Margaret answered that the stone had told enough. Her mother closed her eyes for one brief second. Then she dismissed the maid, shut the parlor doors, and sat in Caleb's old chair. Margaret remained standing. She asked whether Edith had received word before Laura died. Edith said no. Julian sent a messenger after the child was gone. The message stated that if the Sayers wanted their blood kept out of common ground, they could pay for its removal. Edith traveled to Boston that night. At the Cross house, Julian met her downstairs. He said Margaret blamed her mother for the marriage, the poverty, and the baby's death. He said she never wished to see a Sayer again. Edith demanded to hear those words from Margaret herself. Julian refused to let her pass. They struggled at the foot of the stairs. He caught Edith's wrist and shoved her against the banister. She struck him with the brass head of her umbrella. That was the blood Amos had seen. Margaret listened with her hands clenched at her sides. She remembered fever, the ceiling turning above the bed, and once, perhaps a dream, the sound of a woman's voice below. Julian had told her the landlady was arguing with a fish seller. She asked why Edith had believed him. Her mother said she had not believed him entirely, but she had believed enough. Margaret had left without farewell, married without consent, and ignored every warning. Edith had already endured 3 years of silence. Pride did what Julian's locked door could not. It sent her home. Margaret's voice broke. Pride had sent Edith home with Laura's body and left her living daughter behind. Edith accepted the words without defense. That made them hurt more. Margaret asked why no one returned, why Thomas was not sent, why Amos did not come, why her mother could spend money bringing home a coffin but not risk another knock on the door. Edith looked suddenly old. She said she had confused restraint with dignity and punishment with strength. Once Laura was buried, each passing month made action harder. She told herself Margaret would write if she wanted help. When no appeal came, Edith took silence as proof that Julian had spoken truth. Margaret said she had written after her father's death, after Laura's birth, after losing a room in Philadelphia, and again when Julian was ill. She had sent more than a dozen letters. None had reached Rochester. Edith rose so quickly the chair struck the wall. Her face changed, not with surprise alone, but with the horror of a person discovering that a wound she considered mutual had been arranged by someone else. She said only one envelope had come in 18 years. It arrived without a message and contained a dried cutting of After Rain, dead and snapped at the graft. Edith had taken it as an act of contempt. Margaret knew the plant. It was the one Julian knocked from the sill. She had wrapped the surviving cane in wet cloth and asked him to mail it to Amos, hoping the nursery could save it. He said postage on dead sticks was wasteful. She never saw the parcel leave. The cut stem had reached Rochester without her words. For years, mother and daughter had stood on opposite sides of Julian's inventions, each mistaking the other's pain for rejection. Margaret should have felt the old history rearrange itself into relief. Instead, she saw how eagerly both women had accepted the version that protected their pride. Julian had closed the first door.
They had kept it closed from opposite sides. Edith went to the window. She said the damaged cutting had not lived, but she moved the original route to the east house the same week. The nursery was nearly insolvent after Caleb's death and the killing winter. Coal was rationed. She let 2 houses of orchids freeze, but kept that furnace burning. Margaret asked why. Her mother's answer came slowly. Because it was the only living thing she possessed that Margaret had made. Because Laura's grave needed a rose. Because Edith had not known whether she wanted to preserve her daughter or punish herself. Margaret looked at the flowers in the silver bowl, all of them sold under Thomas's name. She said preservation was not the same as love. Edith replied that she knew that now. The admission opened a dangerous silence. Margaret asked whether Edith would correct the false name at the Midsummer Exhibition. Her mother turned from the window. Whatever regret existed in her face withdrew behind calculation. Publicly reversing 18 years of nursery history would destroy confidence in Thomas, threaten the Beckett contract, and feed every person who had waited for the Sayer family to stumble. Hundreds of customers had bought the rose under the established account of its origin. Workers depended on the nursery. Celia's future depended on it. Margaret heard the old machinery begin again. Reputation, dependence, the future of a younger woman offered up to justify the erasure of an older one. Edith said private truth would have to be sufficient. Margaret answered that private truth was where cowards kept what they had stolen. Her mother's hand tightened on the window frame. Margaret left before Edith could dismiss her. For several days, the work between them became a field of quiet battle. Edith ordered the east house closed. Amos opened it whenever the old rose needed air. Margaret did not ask permission. Edith assigned her to packing benches. Thomas came privately to request help with a disease moving through the forcing roses. Frances told the kitchen maid not to set Margaret's place when guests were present. Celia appeared before sunrise with questions and refused to stop. The nursery itself ignored family boundaries. A shipment of young roses from Maryland arrived with swollen knots at their crowns. Thomas believed the growths came from rough handling and wanted them potted before Beckett's inspector visited. Margaret recognized crown gall. If the plants entered the nursery soil, disease could follow them through every house. She ordered the unloading stopped. Thomas reminded her that she had no authority. Margaret replied that disease did not inquire who held authority. The workers waited. Most had known her as a girl. A few had heard the old men call her Miss Margaret, even after Edith forbade it. They looked from brother to sister. Thomas told them to continue. Margaret took her father's shears, cut through one swelling, and exposed the pale, disordered tissue inside. Amos spat into the dirt and said, no diseased plant would cross his threshold while he still drew breath. One by one, the workers set down the crates. Edith arrived in time to see Thomas overruled in his own yard. For a terrible moment, Margaret thought her mother would order the shipment accepted merely to restore the proper hierarchy. Instead, Edith examined the cut crown, looked at Amos, and told the driver to take every plant away. She did not praise Margaret. But that afternoon she sent the keys to the propagation houses to Margaret's bench. The gesture was so characteristic that Margaret almost laughed. Edith could not apologize, so she transferred responsibility. She could not say she trusted her daughter, so she gave her access to every lock except the ones that mattered. Margaret used the keys. Within 2 weeks, the nursery began to change around her. Heating schedules were adjusted. Weak stock was discarded earlier. Cuttings, formerly lost to careless moisture, rooted under muslin shade. Workers who had stopped bringing concerns to Thomas began leaving afflicted leaves on Margaret's bench. She did not take pleasure in her brother's discomfort. Thomas had inherited a title, not a talent, and had spent half his life defending the difference. Edith had praised him publicly for work she knew he had not done. What began as favor had become a trap.
One evening, he found Margaret alone in the packing room, sorting labels for the June orders. He stood by the door and said he had not asked for the rose. Margaret continued sorting. Thomas said he was 12 when Edith first put his name beneath Sayer's devotion. At 14, he was made to pose beside it for a newspaper photographer. By 20, he understood enough to object. Edith told him the nursery needed a male successor and that customers preferred a young prodigy to a runaway daughter. Caleb was dead. Credit given to Edith herself would have provoked ridicule from growers who already doubted a widow's competence. Thomas's name was useful. Then it became permanent. He admitted he had repeated the lie so often that sometimes he remembered the breeding house as if he had stood inside it. Margaret looked at him then. He appeared ashamed, but shame was not restitution. For 18 years he had accepted medals, made speeches, and watched their mother send catalogs across the country. Margaret asked whether he would tell the truth at the exhibition. Thomas rubbed one thumb across the edge of a wooden crate. He said a confession would make him ridiculous in front of every man with whom he did business. Francis would call it ruin. Beckett could cancel the agreement. Margaret said those were consequences, not reasons. He looked toward the open yard where Celia was crossing between houses with a watering can. He asked whether Margaret would risk the girl's security for a name on a card. It was Edith's argument in a gentler voice. Margaret replied that Celia's security could not be built from the same lie now being prepared to imprison her. Thomas left without promising anything. The following day, the keys to the East House appeared among the others. Margaret never learned whether Edith or Thomas placed them there. The old rose opened on the first morning of June. Margaret went to the East House before sunrise and found one copper heart suspended in the gray light. The flower was smaller than those displayed at Horticultural Hall. Its guard petals were irregular. Time had reduced the ancient plant's vigor, but not altered its character. She stood close without touching it. The scent was light, with something resembling apples beneath the usual sweetness. She had forgotten that. Commercial growers had selected later stock for larger flowers and stronger color. The scent had weakened through careless propagation. This bloom carried the first fragrance intact. Celia arrived, followed by Amos. Neither spoke. Margaret cut the flower with her father's shears and carried it to Laura's grave. She had not asked Edith's permission. She no longer believed the deepest acts of love required the family's approval. At the cemetery, she placed the bloom against the small stone. Then she sat beneath the copper beech and told her daughter, silently and without ceremony, the things no child of 8 days could have understood. She told Laura that her mother had not abandoned her body. She had been too ill and too deceived to follow. She told her that the grandmother who buried her had been proud, frightened, loving and cruel, sometimes in the same hour. She told her that Julian's version of the world would no longer be the only one allowed to live. When Margaret returned to the nursery, Edith was waiting beside the East House. Her gaze went first to the empty stem and then to the shears in Margaret's hand. She asked where the bloom had gone. Margaret said, "Where it belonged." Edith's face folded for one instant. She gripped the head of her cane, though Margaret had never seen her use one before. Then she nodded. It was not forgiveness. It was the first truth they had shared without hiding it. Harold Beckett began visiting twice a week. He brought Celia books he had selected without asking what she read. He offered opinions on the color of her dresses. He told Frances that a wife involved in business could be charming, provided she understood that charm and authority were different duties. In front of Edith, he was attentive. Away from her, he corrected Celia with small smiles. Margaret recognized the method. Julian had used warmth as a ribbon around contempt. The prettier the ribbon, the longer it took to see what had been wrapped. One afternoon, Harold found Celia grafting seedlings with Margaret. He laughed at the girl's stained apron and asked whether she meant to become one of the hired men. Celia answered that the hired men knew considerably more about roses than he did. Harold's face altered. Only for a second, but Margaret saw the dislike beneath the courtship. He turned to her and said the household had been charitable to give useful occupation to a woman in her position. Margaret asked what position he meant. He said delicately that everyone understood Mrs. Cross had been left by her husband. Celia's grafting knife stopped. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron. She told Harold he had been misinformed. She had left Julian. The law might lag behind the fact, and polite society might prefer a deserted woman to a departing wife, but she would not accept the more convenient disgrace. Harold said no respectable wife left without cause proven before a court. Margaret looked at Celia as she answered. Cause existed before men certified it. Pain existed before neighbors approved it. A locked room did not become freedom because everyone outside admired the house. Harold left the Glasshouse without saying farewell. By supper, the story had reached Edith. Frances accused Margaret of poisoning Celia against a favorable match. Thomas said Beckett might withdraw his order. Edith listened from the head of the table while Harold's box of candied violets sat unopened on the sideboard. Celia rose before Margaret could defend her. Her voice trembled, but she said Aunt Margaret had not poisoned anything. Harold had done that himself. Celia would not marry him. Frances began to cry. Thomas ordered his daughter to sit. Edith asked Celia whether she understood what she was refusing. The girl answered that she understood more each time everyone tried to explain it. Margaret saw Edith's face harden, and for a moment the years folded together. She expected the old sentence, "You have chosen, carry the consequences." She expected another young woman to be sent into exile for saying no. Instead, Edith looked at Margaret. The entire table waited. At last, Edith told Celia that Harold Beckett would not be received again unless he came on business with his father. The commercial agreement would be considered separately. Frances stared at her. Thomas whispered that Silas Beckett would be insulted. Edith said men survived insult more comfortably than women survived bad marriages. Then she lifted her spoon and finished her soup. No one at the table understood the cost of those words better than Margaret. They were not an apology. They did not restore 18 years. But they interrupted an old cruelty before it could become an inheritance. That night, Celia wept in Margaret's narrow room, not because she wanted Harold, but because refusing him had shown her how much of the family's hope had been placed on her shoulders. She feared the nursery would fail, and everyone would say her selfishness caused it. Margaret brushed the girl's hair as she might have brushed Laura's. She told Celia families often laid their fear on the most obedient person and then called the weight duty. The weight remained real. The name did not make it sacred. Celia asked whether Margaret regretted marrying Julian. The question had no simple answer. Margaret regretted the contempt, the isolation, the work taken from her, and the years she had surrendered after love died. Yet if she reduced her younger self to foolishness, she would join Edith in punishing the girl she had been. She said she regretted mistaking defiance for freedom. Julian had offered a door out of her mother's house, and she had not looked closely at the room beyond it. But the desire to choose had not been wrong. Celia leaned against her shoulder. Below them, the boiler whistle sounded twice. A pressure valve had begun to fail. Margaret went down in her wrapper and worked beside Amos until dawn. By morning, every glasshouse was still warm. The storm came on June 17th. The day began close and yellow. By 3 o'clock, the sky over the Genesee had turned the color of bruised metal. Workers hurried to lower shades and secure vents. Thomas ordered the sails awnings rolled. Amos watched clouds gather over the western roofs and said they would have hail. The first stones were small. They rattled harmlessly against glass. Then the wind struck. It came across the property with a roar, lifting empty flats and driving rain sideways. A pane shattered in the Carnation House. Another broke above the packing room. Within seconds, the whole nursery rang with impact. Margaret ran toward the propagation houses, shouting for the workers to get beneath the benches. Through a curtain of rain, she saw Celia crossing the yard. The girl was heading for the east house. The ancient rose held 6 newly rooted cuttings. If the roof failed, 18 years of preservation could vanish in 1 minute. Celia knew what the plant meant.
She also believed, as young people often did, that understanding danger made her faster than it. Margaret called her name. Wind swallowed the sound. Celia reached the east house just as a sheet of glass slid from the roof and exploded across the path behind her. Margaret followed. Inside, rain poured through 3 openings. Hail bounced white on the brick floor. Celia had lifted the tray of cuttings but could not reach the door because a roof bar had fallen across the aisle. Margaret climbed over the bench. Her pain struck the timbers above her and broke into long blades. One sliced her sleeve and opened the skin beneath. She reached Celia, pushed the girl under the heavy potting table, and covered her head with both arms. The old rose tore free from one wall wire. Its cane swung across the house. The clay tub rocked. Then Edith appeared in the doorway. She had no hat. Rain had flattened her gray hair against her head.
She carried a horse blanket from the stable and shouted for them to cover themselves. Another roof bar gave way. Edith stepped inside to throw the blanket. The bar struck her shoulder and drove her to the floor. Margaret did not remember deciding whom to save first. She shoved the tray at Celia, dragged the girl toward the door, then went back for her mother. Edith tried to stand and could not. Together, Margaret and Amos, who arrived through the rain, carried her out beneath the horse blanket. Behind them, the east roof folded inward. Glass, timber, and water came down over the original route of after rain. Edith's collarbone was broken. The doctor bound her shoulder and ordered 6 weeks of rest, an instruction she received as if he had proposed 6 weeks of moral decline. Margaret sat beside the bed through the first night. Her mother drifted in and out of sleep under laudanum. Once she reached with her uninjured hand and caught Margaret's wrist.
She called her by name, not Mrs. Cross, not child, but Margaret, with the bewildered tenderness of someone speaking from a place pride could not enter. By morning she remembered nothing. Celia had a cut along her cheek. It would heal, though Francis looked at it as if a ruined marriage prospect were already visible in the narrow red line. The girl herself cared only about the tray of cuttings. 4 of the 6 had survived. The original plant seemed lost. Workers cleared the east house after the storm passed. They lifted broken frames and shoveled glass from the paths. The clay tub had split beneath a fallen beam. Half the old trunk lay crushed under brick. Thomas wanted the wreckage removed with the dead stock. There were customers to serve and 3 other houses to repair. Sentiment could not delay business. Margaret knelt among the debris and scraped mud from the root crown. At the rear, protected by the broken curve of the tub, one pale shoot remained attached. It was no longer than her smallest finger. The storm had stripped every leaf from it, but the tissue beneath the bark was green. Living wood bent first. She ordered a wooden box, fresh soil, and 2 men to help lift the root. Thomas objected, until Amos took off his cap, looked him full in the face, and said he would leave the Sayer nursery before he burned Miss Margaret's rose. Other workers stopped what they were doing. Thomas understood the choice. The nursery could replace glass more easily than it could replace people who knew how to make plants live. He sent for the box. The root was moved to the safest corner of the frost house. Margaret cut away splintered wood, sealed the largest wound, and shaded the surviving shoot with a piece of muslin. For days, there was no sign of change. She visited before attending Edith, after supervising repairs, and once each night. she did not pray for it. She had prayed too often beside Laura's basket and learned that desperation was not a bargain nature honored. She gave the plant what it required and allowed uncertainty to remain. That, she thought, might be the hardest kind of care. With Edith confined upstairs, the nursery had to decide whom it obeyed. Thomas held the legal authority and the family title, but workers brought practical decisions to Margaret. She arranged repairs according to the needs of plants rather than the visibility of customers. She moved azaleas from a damaged house, delayed a shipment that would have exposed tender stock, and persuaded a local glazier to mend the propagation roof before the decorative conservatory. Silas Beckett arrived 2 days after the storm. He surveyed the broken panes and expressed sympathy in the tone of a man pleased to find another person negotiating from weakness. He would keep his large order, he said, if the Sayers granted him control of the new rose and reduced the price on Sayers' devotion. He also assumed the unfortunate misunderstanding with Harold and Celia could be repaired. Margaret answered before Thomas could. The nursery would discuss plants with Mr. Beckett. It would not discuss Celia. Beckett looked at her as if a chair had spoken. Thomas introduced Margaret as his widowed sister. The lie was meant to protect her from the more complicated truth. Still, Margaret felt the ease with which her life was altered for a man's comfort. She corrected him. She said she was his married sister, living apart from her husband, and currently directing restoration of the damaged houses. Beckett's eyebrows rose. He asked whether Edith had approved this arrangement. From an upstairs window came the sharp tap of her mother's cane against the sill. One tap meant yes when Edith lacked patience for stairs. Margaret almost smiled. Beckett left without a new agreement. Thomas accused her of risking the nursery's future. Margaret reminded him that Beckett had tried to purchase his daughter at a discount after a storm. Thomas flinched at the words, but did not deny them. By the end of the week, he had rejected Beckett's terms. Frances blamed Margaret. Edith, from her bed, said only that a buyer who confused desperation with consent would eventually confuse partnership with ownership. It was the nearest she came to praise. During Edith's recovery, mother and daughter spent more time together than they had in the previous 2 decades. Margaret changed bandages, arranged pillows, and carried trays upstairs. Edith complained about overcooked eggs, the position of the curtains, the incompetence of the temporary foreman, and the humiliating softness of her bed. She did not complain about pain. At first, they spoke only of the nursery. Gradually, illness loosened older subjects. Edith described the winter after Caleb died. Creditors had called at the sales office. 2 furnaces failed. Men who had accepted instructions from Caleb refused the same instructions from his widow. One grower told her to sell the property before grief made her ambitious. She had 3 children, 40 workers at the height of the season, and a nursery full of living things that could not wait for society to become fair. Sayer's devotion opened that spring, as if unaware of death. Orders arrived faster than the family could fill them. The rose gave Edith leverage with buyers who would not otherwise sit across a desk from a woman. But when she presented it under her own name, 2 men from the Horticultural Society joked that perhaps widowhood had made her a hybridist overnight. So she used Thomas. A boy genius was charming, a capable widow was threatening. A married daughter, who had fled the family, was scandal. Edith told herself the name on the card was a small falsehood in service of many lives. Each year the nursery depended more heavily on the story. Each year correction became more costly. Margaret listened, then said Edith had been asked to choose between truth and survival by men who profited from the choice. That was unjust. Passing the injustice to her daughter had still been a choice. Edith looked toward the window. She said Margaret had acquired a severe tongue. Margaret answered that silence had not served either of them. To her surprise, Edith gave a short laugh. It ended in pain, and Margaret had to steady her shoulder, but the sound remained between them afterward. On another afternoon, Edith asked about Julian.
Margaret gave facts without drama. The cities, the catalog work, the debts, Laura, the women she had suspected and the ones she had finally seen. She described the day she left and the 5 months of labor afterward. She did not ask for pity.
Pity was often another way of making a woman small. Edith listened with her face turned away. When Margaret finished, her mother said she had imagined Julian striking her. He had, twice. But those were not the worst memories. Bruises healed and carried no confusion. The worst injuries were the years in which he made her doubt her own sight, then used her uncertainty as evidence that she was unwell. Edith's hand tightened over the coverlet. She said she had done something similar whenever Margaret named the rose. The honesty was so exact that Margaret could not protect herself from it. She sat beside the bed. Neither woman reached for the other. Some distances were not crossed by one confession, but for the first time, they measured the same distance. The surviving shoot on the old root opened 2 leaves. Margaret showed Edith by carrying the wooden box beneath her bedroom window. Her mother leaned out farther than the doctor allowed. Morning light touched her gray hair, and the stern lines around her mouth eased. Celia began a watercolor study of the new growth. She had a precise hand, less dramatic than Julian's and more truthful. Margaret encouraged her to paint the scarred trunk as well as the leaves. Frances objected. A picture should display a plant at its best. Celia said survival was its best. The storm had delayed preparation for the Midsummer Exhibition, but not canceled it. Mrs. Vining sent word that the society expected the promised new Sayer rose. Beckett spread rumors that the nursery was unstable. Competitors visited under the pretense of sympathy and counted broken panes. Thomas proposed exhibiting the smoky pink seedling as Sayer's Promise. It had produced a second flower more evenly formed than the first. If displayed carefully, no judge would know the stem remained weak. Margaret refused. The plant had not passed a winter outdoors. Its color varied with temperature. Its hips had not been tested. Selling it widely would turn customers into unwilling experiments. Thomas reminded her that the nursery needed attention after the storm. Margaret said it needed trust more. Celia stood with her. She would not present the seedling as finished work. Edith surprised everyone by supporting them. From a chair in the packing room, her arm still bound, she told Thomas that the family had borrowed enough from future truth. They would display the seedling only as a work in progress, without offering it for sale. Mrs. Vining called the decision timid. Beckett called it proof that women lacked commercial courage. Orders slowed. Margaret continued. She began preparing an exhibit unlike the grand arrangement Edith usually favored. There would be no silver bowls or false abundance. The ancient root, with its storm-broken trunk and new leaves, would stand beside the 4 surviving cuttings. Sayer's devotion would be shown at different ages, from weak graft to mature bloom. Celia's unfinished seedling would appear at the end, clearly identified as untested. The exhibit would show not perfection, but process. Thomas hated the idea. Frances called it an exhibition of family infirmity. Edith examined the design and asked where the prize specimen would stand. Margaret said the living root was the prize specimen. Her mother looked at the blackened brass tag still wired to the trunk. M.S. She did not order it removed. Julian Cross arrived on a hot morning in early July. Margaret was in the sales yard inspecting storm replacements when she heard his laugh inside the office. Her body recognized the sound before her mind did. The yard narrowed. The air seemed to vanish between one breath and the next. For 18 years, she had watched doors for him. Even after leaving, some part of her had remained trained to the turn of his key, the tempo of his step, the weather of his return. He came outside carrying his straw hat. At 46, Julian remained handsome in the softened way of men who considered charm a profession. Silver touched his dark hair.
He wore a cream summer suit and a green tie. No one looking at him would have imagined the unpaid rooms, the borrowed money, or the wife whose drawings he signed. He smiled as though Margaret had inconvenienced them both with a misunderstanding. Thomas followed, visibly alarmed. Behind him stood Mrs. Vining, who had been choosing palms for the exhibition and now wore the alert expression of a woman unexpectedly rewarded for leaving home. Julian said he had come to take his wife back. The sentence traveled across the sales yard. 2 customers pretended to examine begonias. A packing boy stopped hammering. Margaret's first feeling was not fear. It was fury that he had chosen an audience. She told him he had come a long way for something that did not belong to him. Julian lowered his voice, making tenderness visible to everyone. He said she had been ill, overwhelmed by grief and confused by false suspicions. Lillian Price was merely a professional associate. He forgave Margaret for leaving and had prepared a home for her return. Mrs. Vining murmured that reconciliation was a sacred duty. Margaret looked at Julian's cuffs. The left one bore a faint violet smudge. Lillian used violet ink to sign the publicity cards Julian had once brought home. He had not even changed the shirt carefully enough. Margaret said forgiveness offered without truth was only another performance. Julian's smile thinned. He asked to speak privately. She refused. He then produced a portfolio. Inside were botanical plates Margaret had made over 15 years. Roses, lilies, striped carnations, a spray of winter jasmine. Some carried Julian's signature. Others had not yet been signed. He had heard the Sayer Nursery needed a new catalog after the storm. He proposed a reunion useful to everyone. Margaret could resume preparing illustrations. Julian would handle publication and restore her social position as his wife. The Sayers would gain favorable terms through his contacts. It was the old room offered again with fresh wallpaper. Thomas glanced toward the plates. The nursery did need them. Mrs. Vining saw a respectable ending to a troubling story. Even Frances, watching from the house, seemed to hope Margaret would accept and remove herself from Celia's future. Julian mistook their interest for victory. He said a woman alone at 38 should consider how few men would overlook her mistakes. From the office doorway came the tap of a cane. Edith had descended the stairs without assistance. Her arm remained in a sling. She crossed the yard slowly and stopped beside Margaret. She asked Julian what mistakes he meant. He bowed to her with the charm he once used when courting her daughter. He spoke of sorrow, rash decisions, and Christian repair. He did not mention Laura's letters, the intercepted messages, or the house in Cambridge. Edith listened until he finished. Then she struck the portfolio from his hand with her cane. Paintings slid across the gravel. The entire yard went silent. Edith said she had once permitted Julian Cross to stand between her and her daughter because admitting she had judged badly was harder than blaming the girl who proved it. She would not repeat the mistake for the comfort of Rochester society. Mrs. Vining gasped. Julian's face lost its polish. He reminded Edith that Margaret was legally his wife. Edith answered that the law might give him a claim to argument. It did not give him a room in her house, a bench in her nursery, or one more minute of Margaret's obedience. Margaret felt every person in the yard looking at her. For years, she had imagined rescue as someone stronger opening a door. Now that her mother stood beside her, Margaret understood the danger of letting rescue become another form of authority. She stepped forward before Edith could speak again. She told Julian the decision was hers. She would not return. She would seek a legal separation and, if the law allowed, a divorce. The unsigned paintings were hers. The signed paintings could remain monuments to what he had needed to steal. He could leave alone. Julian looked at her with genuine astonishment. Not pain, not love, astonishment. He had mistaken her endurance for a permanent feature of the world. He gathered the plates slowly. Before departing, he turned so only Margaret could hear and said he could still ruin the exhibition. He knew how Sayer's devotion had been created. He knew whose name had appeared in every catalog. If the family wanted a public contest over truth, he would make certain no one emerged clean. Margaret answered that cleanliness was no longer her highest ambition. Julian left the yard. Mrs. Vining left 5 minutes later and carried the story into town before noon. By evening, everyone, from the florist on East Main Street to the women folding linens at the church hospital, had heard that Margaret Sayer Cross had refused her husband publicly, and Edith Sayer had defended her. The version changed with each telling. In some, Julian had knelt. In others, Margaret had threatened him with pruning shears. One account gave Edith a horsewhip. The details did not matter. The respectable ending Mrs. Vining expected had failed to occur. Women began visiting the nursery for reasons they pretended were botanical. A baker's wife came for a climbing rose and quietly said her sister had gone back to a violent husband because no family door remained open. A schoolteacher bought lavender and thanked Margaret for speaking where people could hear. An older woman in mourning touched her hand without explanation. There were hostile visitors, too. 2 church women returned their order for altar lilies. A man told Thomas that domestic rebellion was poor advertising. Francis wept over every cancellation. But the nursery did not empty. For the first time, Margaret saw that reputation was not a single wall. It was hundreds of judgments, and some belonged to people who'd been waiting for a crack. 3 days before the Midsummer Exhibition, the Horticultural Society rejected Margaret's display card. The card identified the old rose as After Rain, bred by Margaret Sayer in 1888 and later sold as Sayer's Devotion. It identified Thomas as the person under whose name the rose had been introduced. It also credited Edith with preserving the original root. Mrs. Vining returned it through a messenger. The society, she wrote, could not permit private family disputes to alter the recognized origin of an established variety. The display might enter as Sayer's Devotion by Thomas Sayer or not enter at all. Thomas read the decision twice. He said perhaps correction should wait until after the exhibition. They could publish a modest announcement in the autumn when attention had moved elsewhere. Margaret asked how many autumns truth required. He had no answer. Edith sat at the office desk with her sling removed, but one arm still weak. The storm had left a white scar near her temple. She looked from the rejected card to the old root waiting outside in its wooden box. For most of her life, Edith had treated timing as a moral virtue. There was always a correct season for speech, grief, marriage, ambition, and forgiveness. People who suffered outside the proper season were expected to contain themselves until society found them convenient. She told Thomas to print a second card exactly like the first. Thomas warned that the society might refuse the entire Sayer exhibit. Edith said then the refusal would stand beside the rose where everyone could see it. Margaret studied her mother. She had wanted this decision so fiercely that receiving it made her unsteady. Edith did not look at her. She simply reached for another page of exhibition instructions and asked how many men were needed to transport the root without damaging the new shoot. The following morning, Silas Beckett canceled his order. His telegram contained no mention of Harold or Celia. It referred to uncertainty in management and injurious publicity. Thomas read it in the packing room, sat on a crate, and covered his face. The order would have filled 2 houses through winter. Without it, seasonal workers would have fewer weeks of employment. Repairs would take longer. The family might have to sell the strip of land along the southern road. Truth had acquired weight, wages, and names. Margaret felt the old temptation to surrender. It was easy to be brave while imagining only personal cost, much harder when other families depended on the consequences. Amos found her later among the empty benches. He said Edith had faced the same fear after Caleb died.
That did not make Edith's choice right. It made the choice understandable, which was different and sometimes more painful. Margaret asked whether she was now repeating her mother's mistake in reverse, sacrificing survival for her own need to be recognized. Amos considered this. Then he pointed toward the workers preparing ordinary local orders: cemetery roses, fruit trees, geraniums for boarding house windows, shrubs for new homes. The Beckett Agreement would have made the nursery larger. It was not the only thing keeping it alive. He said families often confused the biggest future with the only future. Margaret thought of Julian, who always described each new scheme as their last chance. She thought of Edith arranging Celia beside Harold as if refusal meant ruin. Fear made narrow paths look like bridges over an abyss. She returned to the office and offered to withdraw her card if Thomas believed every smaller choice had truly been exhausted. Thomas surprised her. He said no. He had spent 18 years accepting honor because correcting it seemed too expensive. The price had not grown smaller. It had merely been passed forward, to Margaret, to Celia, and to himself. If he delayed again, the nursery might survive, but he would become incapable of knowing whether anything said about him was true. Frances stood in the doorway. Her eyes were swollen from crying. For weeks, she had treated Margaret as the source of every danger. Now she crossed the office, placed Beckett's telegram on the stove, and touched a match to one corner. Flames curled through the words until the paper blackened. She said she still wished the truth had been less costly. Margaret answered that so did she. It was the first honest thing they had said to each other. Horticultural Hall smelled of wet leaves, hot glass, and hundreds of flowers opened under careful timing. Exhibitors arrived before dawn on July 12th. Men carried palms in tubs. Women arranged sweet peas in long banks of color. Florists unpacked carnations, ferns, lilies, and roses cushioned in damp cotton. Outside, carriages filled the avenue. The Midsummer Exhibition was one of Rochester's proud occasions, a celebration of the industry that had made the city known far beyond New York. The Sayer space stood near the center aisle, where the family had displayed for 26 years. Margaret supervised the placement of the old root. Its broken trunk rose from the wooden box, black and scarred. Beside the wound, the surviving shoot now carried 7 leaves. The 4 rooted cuttings stood in plain clay pots. Mature flowers of Sayer's devotion completed the curve. At the far end, Celia placed her smoky pink seedling beneath a card that read, "Unnamed, first year of trial, not for sale." Frances brought white cloths but did not conceal the wooden box. Thomas hung no blue ribbons from earlier exhibitions. Edith arrived in violet, with one glove folded over the hand she could not yet raise fully. The corrected card stood at the front. After Rain. Bred by Margaret Sayer, 1888. Introduced as Sayer's Devotion under the name of Thomas Sayer, 1890. Original root preserved by Edith Sayer. Before the doors opened, Mrs. Vining appeared with 3 members of the exhibition committee. She read the card. Her mouth became a narrow line. The society had made its position clear, she said. The card must be removed. Edith answered that the society's position was also welcome to be displayed if Mrs. Vining wished to provide it in writing. The committee members shifted uncomfortably. A public refusal beside one of the city's most famous roses would invite the very questions they hoped to avoid. Mrs. Vining turned to Thomas. She reminded him that he was head of the Sayer Nursery and asked whether he supported this humiliating attack on his own reputation. Thomas looked ill. Margaret knew how easy it would be for him to step backward. The hall held men who had toasted him, purchased from him, and repeated his story. Frances stood rigid beside Celia. Edith did not rescue him with an order. Thomas removed his hat. He said the attack on his reputation had begun when he accepted a reputation that was not his.
The card was accurate. Mrs. Vining stared at him. One committee member, a bulb grower from Geneva, stepped closer to the old root. He had known Caleb Sayer and remembered Margaret working in the breeding house as a girl. He asked Amos whether he had witnessed the cross. Amos said he had. Miss Margaret selected the parents, raised the seedling, and struck the brass tag herself. Thomas had been more interested in catching frogs near the boiler drain. The bulb grower coughed to hide a smile.
Mrs. Vining declared that oral recollections inside a divided family could not revise established horticultural history. A familiar voice answered from behind her that perhaps his recollection would be useful. Julian stood in the aisle. He wore a dark morning coat despite the heat and carried the same leather portfolio. Several newspaper men accompanied him. He had not come to restore a marriage. He had come to place himself at the center of its collapse. He announced that Sayer's devotion had been created through a collaboration between husband and wife. He had named it, painted its first portrait, and advised Margaret on color and form. Whatever work she performed before marriage became part of the artistic partnership they later shared. If the Sayer family intended to reassign credit, his contribution could not be omitted. The crowd thickened around the exhibit. Mrs. Vining looked relieved. A dispute between two households could be dismissed as scandal. A woman's sole claim was more dangerous. Julian opened the portfolio and displayed a watercolor of the rose dated 1888. His signature appeared at the bottom. Margaret had forgotten the painting. He made it during the thunderstorm when the first bloom opened. He had painted while she told him the parentage and held the lamp. The picture was beautiful. It was also a picture of work already done. Julian said the phrase, Sayer's devotion, had been his. That much was nearly true. He had compared the copper center to devotion after disappointment. Edith later used part of the phrase for the catalogue name. Margaret had privately named the seedling After Rain. For years, men had taken pieces around her labor, the painting, the commercial name, the public introduction, and arranged them until the labor itself disappeared. Margaret's hands began to tremble. She saw the old pattern preparing to close, Julian charming, Edith commanding, Thomas apologizing, committees deciding, Margaret reduced to the silent place at the center. Celia moved beside her. The girl said nothing. She only placed Margaret's pruning shears on the table before the old root. The black leather handles were worn to the shape of her hand. Margaret touched them and remembered the first cut after frost. Laura's rose at the grave, the splintered trunk after the storm. Work was not an idea hovering above the body. It was years held in muscle, attention, failure, and return. She addressed the committee, not Julian. She described the cross, a vigorous, pale climber chosen as seed parent, a copper damask hybrid as pollen parent, the hips tied in muslin, the seeds stratified in sand through winter. She described the first 12 seedlings, 9 discarded for weakness, 2 for poor form, and 1 selected from the rear bench. She explained the rose's tendency to lose scent when repeatedly budded from the most visually perfect but least fragrant stock. She pointed to the old root's apple note and invited the judges to compare it with the commercial flowers. The bulb grower leaned to smell both. Others followed. The difference was faint, but unmistakable. Julian interrupted. Technical memory, he said, did not settle ownership between spouses. Margaret turned to him. She asked which parent produced the hips. He hesitated. She asked how many seeds germinated, what color the first leaves were, and why the original plant showed a swelling low on the east side of the trunk. He could answer none of it. The swelling came from a mouse wound Margaret had sealed with clay before the seedling's first winter. Amos confirmed it. Julian's charm began to fracture. He said no lady should be subjected to this display while recovering from nervous illness. He had come only because he remained concerned for his wife. Margaret replied the concern which required her silence had another name. Mrs. Vining ordered the doors kept closed until the dispute ended. Outside, visitors were already gathering. Newspaper men wrote rapidly. Then Silas Beckett entered with Herald. Beckett informed the committee that his firm had withdrawn support from Sayers because instability made the nursery unreliable. He suggested the society protect the reputation of Rochester growers by excluding the display entirely. Harold looked at Celia's scar and then at her work apron. Whatever affection he had performed was gone. He told her she could still ask her father to repair matters. Celia said the matter had been repaired when he stopped visiting. A few workers at the rear laughed before catching themselves. Beckett's face reddened. He called the Sayer women ungovernable. Edith stepped forward. Until that moment, she had allowed Margaret and Thomas to speak.
For a woman who had controlled every room for decades, the restraint itself was a confession. Now she placed her good hand on the wooden box that held the old root. She said the society did not need to investigate a mystery. She had created the false history herself. The hall went completely still. Edith spoke without the tremor Margaret expected. After Caleb's death, the nursery needed a success the trade would accept. Her daughter had gone. Her son was available. Edith put Thomas's name beneath Margaret's rose and taught both children that survival excused the theft. Thomas was a boy when the lie began. Margaret had no part in it. Julian had painted the flower and suggested a phrase, but he had not bred it. Mrs. Vining whispered that Edith should consider the family name. Edith looked at her oldest acquaintance and said she had considered it for 18 years. That was long enough to remember a family name existed to identify the people in a family, not to erase the inconvenient ones. Then she turned toward Margaret. In front of the growers who had doubted her as a widow, the buyers whose approval she had courted, the churchwomen whose judgment she had feared, and the son whose borrowed fame had protected her business, Edith Sayer named her daughter. She said Margaret Sayer Cross had created After Rain. Margaret had also saved the nursery's stock after the frost, protected it from disease, directed the storm repairs, and trained the next Sayer hybridist. If those facts injured the nursery, then the nursery would have to become strong enough to survive truth. Margaret had imagined this moment in angry fragments. In some versions, the crowd applauded. In others, Edith begged forgiveness, and every lost year returned. Reality was quieter. Someone shifted a pot. A reporter's pencil scratched. Frances began to cry without making a sound.
Thomas stared at the floor. Amos replaced his cap. Margaret looked at her mother and felt no miracle. Laura was still dead. 18 years were still spent. Edith's public words could not enter the rooms where Margaret had waited, or the fevered bed where Julian told her she was unwanted. But the words changed what would happen next. They changed what Celia had heard. They changed what Thomas could continue accepting. They changed the card beside the rose. Sometimes recognition came too late to heal the past, and just in time to stop its repetition. The bulb grower from Geneva told the committee he would judge the exhibit on horticultural merit. Another member agreed. A third said excluding the rose now would make the society a participant in a deception it could no longer claim not to understand. Mrs. Vining was outvoted. The doors opened. Visitors flowed into the hall and found the Sayer family standing beside a scarred root with no prize ribbon. Word moved faster than the crowd.
People read the card, looked at Margaret, smelled the old bloom, and read the card again. Julian remained long enough to discover the attention no longer belonged to him. Then he closed his portfolio and walked out. Silas Beckett followed. Harold went with him. The Sayer exhibit did not win the grand medal. The judges said the presentation resisted ordinary categories. Celia's seedling received no prize because it was unfinished, exactly as the card admitted. But all day people returned to the old root. They were drawn to its broken trunk and 7 new leaves. Some asked to order After Rain under its restored name. Others wanted the commercially familiar Sayer's Devotion, but asked that Margaret's name appear on the plant label. A widow from Canandaigua requested 50 for a new hospital garden. A schoolmistress ordered one and said she preferred flowers with complicated histories. Near closing, a young woman in a plain brown dress approached Margaret. She had come with her husband, who was examining fruit trees across the aisle. In a low voice, she said she used to paint designs for his furniture shop. He signed them and told customers they were his. She had believed marriage made protest disloyal. Margaret did not tell her to leave him. She did not promise courage would be rewarded. She asked whether the woman still painted. The woman said she had stopped. Margaret placed Celia's watercolor of the scarred rose root where she could see it. She told her to begin with one honest line and keep it under her own name. The woman stood before the picture for a long time. When she left, she carried no secret instructions and no borrowed object. Only the knowledge that another woman had spoken aloud and remained standing afterward. The weeks after the exhibition were not easy. Newspaper stories brought orders, but also mockery. One cartoon showed Edith watering a family quarrel while Thomas hid behind a flower pot. Julian gave an interview in Boston describing Margaret as talented but unstable. Mrs. Vining resigned from the exhibition committee and continued attending church as if she had been martyred by accuracy. The Beckett contract did not return. The nursery sold the southern strip of land. Winter repairs were completed, one house at a time. Some seasonal workers found longer employment elsewhere. Thomas spent months rebuilding relationships with smaller buyers who cared more about healthy stock than scandal. He never again permitted his name to appear as hybridist. Frances struggled with the change. She had organized her life around avoiding public shame and now lived in a family discussed from Buffalo to Syracuse. Yet when Celia applied for a course of horticultural study in Ithaca, Frances sewed the strongest traveling case anyone had ever seen and lined it with blue cloth. Love, in Frances, often arrived disguised as preparation. Celia postponed formal study for 1 year to continue testing the smoky pink seedling. Its stems strengthened in the second season. Its color remained unstable, turning nearly mauve in cool weather and warm rose in heat. She considered that a flaw until Margaret suggested constancy was not the only form of character. They did not name it yet. Margaret moved out of the third-floor room before autumn. Edith offered her the large bedroom overlooking the west lawn. It had belonged to Margaret as a girl. Accepting would have looked like restoration, but Margaret no longer wanted to be restored to the position from which she had once escaped. She rented a small cottage at the edge of the nursery, close enough to hear the boiler whistle and far enough to close her own door. The first night there, she placed her father's pruning shears on a hook beside the kitchen window. She set a pot of winter jasmine on the sill and unpacked a clean sheet of drawing paper. Her hand shook when she lifted the pencil. For years, she had drawn leaves Julian chose, corrected work he signed, and watched her own lines disappear beneath his name. Now no publisher waited. No catalog required anything. The blank page frightened her because it belonged entirely to her. She began with the broken trunk of After Rain. One honest line became another. By midnight, 7 leaves opened across the paper. Margaret filed for divorce that winter. Julian contested the petition, then withdrew his objection when testimony about the Cambridge house threatened to become public. The process was slow and humiliating. Lawyers translated years of injury into narrow categories the court recognized. Neighbors discussed whether a woman approaching 40 needed freedom badly enough to expose a failed marriage. Margaret continued. When the decree finally came, she did not celebrate in the way Celia expected. She went to Laura's grave with a pair of gloves and pruned the little rose. Edith was already there. Her shoulder had healed badly. She could no longer raise her left arm above the waist, so she held the basket while Margaret worked. They had begun visiting together once a month. Some days they spoke, some days the old hurts stood between them like another stone. On that winter morning, Edith said she used to believe confession was the same as repair. Margaret cut a crossing branch and waited. Edith said the exhibition had taught her otherwise. Speaking truth had been necessary. It had also been the smallest part. Repair was accepting that Margaret might never return to the house, never call the past forgivable, and never make Edith feel absolved. Margaret looked at her mother across Laura's grave. She said she did not know whether forgiveness was a gate a person passed through once. Some mornings she understood Edith. Some mornings she was 19 again and furious. Some nights she heard a voice below the Boston stairs and hated them both for not reaching harder. Edith nodded. She said she hated herself for it every day. Margaret put down the shears. Self-hatred, she said, was not repair either. It made pain face inward, but kept it at the center. If Edith wanted to help, she could use the years left to make fewer locked doors. The words stayed with her mother. That spring, Edith rebuilt the East Glasshouse. She did not restore it as a private shrine. The new roof was plain, the benches sturdy, the furnace modest. She designated half the space for experimental stock and half for paid training. Widows, unmarried daughters, and women living apart from husbands could learn propagation there without being treated as charity cases. Their work was exacting, and their wages ordinary. Edith insisted on both. The first two trainees were the baker's sister and a former hotel laundress. A schoolteacher joined during summer recess. Frances organized lunches and pretended the arrangement had always been sensible. Above the door hung no moral motto, only a wooden sign. East Propagation House, Margaret Sayer Cross, hybridist, Celia Sayer, assistant. Edith ordered the sign. Thomas hung it. Margaret chose to leave it there. 3 years passed before Celia's rose was ready. It survived 2 Rochester winters without protection. Its stems grew stronger. The blooms still changed with weather, smoky lilac after cold rain, warm pink beneath summer heat, but their form held and their light spice scent deepened in the evening. By then, Celia had completed a year of study and returned with notebooks full of questions that delighted Margaret and exhausted Thomas. She refused 2 proposals, accepted none out of fear, and stopped tucking her thumb inside her fist when she spoke at growers' meetings. Edith grew smaller, but not mild. She criticized watering, questioned every expense, and intimidated visitors from a chair near the East House door. Yet she no longer introduced Celia as the future wife of anyone. She introduced her as a hybridist. The old root of After Rain lived in the center bay. It never regained its former size. The storm wound remained open along one side, a deep fold in the wood. Each year it produced fewer blooms than the young commercial plants. Each year those blooms carried the lost apple scent. Margaret refused to make it a relic. Cuttings were taken. New plants went into gardens, schoolyards, and cemetery plots. The restored labels carried both names. After Rain, formerly Sayer's Devotion. Bred by Margaret Sayer Cross, Rochester, 1888. Some customers preferred the old commercial name. Margaret did not fight them. A flower could carry history without being trapped by it. When Celia's rose was finally introduced in 1910, the family gathered in the East House before the public presentation. Thomas proposed several grand names. Frances preferred Celia Sayer's Victory. Edith said victory was a word people chose when they wanted to hide the graves beside the road. Celia had already decided. She named the rose Laura's Weather. Margaret could not speak at first. Celia explained that the flower did not keep one color through every condition. It answered cold, heat, rain, and sun,
without becoming a different plant. She wanted Laura's brief life attached not to sorrow alone, but to something that changed and remained itself. Margaret looked at Edith. Her mother's eyes filled, but she made no attempt to hide or command the tears. The first plant of Laura's weather went beside the small stone under the copper beech. They planted it together, Margaret loosening the roots, Celia holding the cane, Thomas filling soil, Francis bringing water, and Edith seated nearby with her cane across her knees. No photographer attended. No society judged the arrangement.
It was only a family performing one truthful act in a place where many truths had arrived late. After the others walked back toward the wagon, Edith remained beside Margaret. She said she had once believed keeping the old rose alive was enough. Coal, glass, water, pruning, those were forms of love she understood. Words had frightened her because they could be refused. Margaret looked at the 2 roses by Laura's grave. After rain, thorny and established, and Laura's weather, young and changing color in the afternoon light. She told her mother that care given in silence could keep something alive. It could not always tell the living person she was loved. Edith accepted this. Then, without speech or ceremony, she offered her hand. Margaret did not become a child again. She did not forget the service door, the gray dress, the stolen name, or the years when pride had done Julian's work for him. She took her mother's hand as the woman she had become, separate, wounded, capable of leaving.
That was why the gesture mattered. They sat until the light moved through the copper beech and warmed Laura's stone. Years later, people who visited the Sayer Nursery often asked to see the famous original root. They expected beauty. Instead, they found an old plant in a wooden box, its trunk scarred by age and storm, its shape permanently altered by survival. In June, a few cream petals opened around a copper heart. Margaret never told visitors the rose proved everything happened for a reason. She did not believe that. Laura had not died so a flower could be named. 18 years had not been stolen so a family might learn honesty. Suffering did not become wise merely because someone survived it. What the rose proved was smaller and more useful. Damage and death were not the same. A living stem might bend. A root might wait beneath ruin. A woman might return to the place where her name had been taken and choose neither surrender nor revenge.
A mother might admit love had become control. A brother might lay down praise he had not earned. A young woman might refuse the future selected for her and remain part of the family afterward. None of it restored what was gone. It made room for what had not yet grown. On summer mornings, Margaret opened the East House vents before the heat gathered. Women arrived by streetcar, on foot, and sometimes with children who played near the potting shed. Celia moved between the trial beds with a pencil behind one ear. Thomas argued with suppliers. Francis carried strong coffee in a dented pot. Edith watched from her chair until age finally kept her in the house, and even then she tapped the window with her cane when she believed someone had watered too heavily. Above them, new glass held the sky. Near the door, after rain climbed its wire. The blackened brass tag remained on the old trunk, the letters still uneven from the blow of a 19-year-old hand. M.S. Margaret no longer needed the initials to prove the rose was hers. She kept them so no one entering the Glasshouse would mistake silence for absence again.